Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Lukas Degutis and this is our weekly omnibus. Before we get started, don't forget to browse our new Spectator shop if you haven't. We've got prints, caps, puzzles and much more. There are handy links in the description below. In case you missed it, in this week's issue we reflect on the passing of Pope Francis, his legacy and what lies ahead for the next Pope. Damian Thompson, our associate editor, argues that whether liberal or conservative, the successor to Francis will face immense challenges. Elsewhere in the magazine, Luke Daly-Groves explores why Hitler conspiracy theories refuse to die. Henry Hill considers whether the Anglosphere can survive Donald Trump, and Kenton Allen relishes the pleasures of a longer lunch. Now, the week. Following the Pope's passing on Easter Monday, Freddie Gray spoke to Ed Condon about whether there'll be a Pope Francis 2.0.
Today we are going to be talking about the death of the Pope, Pope Francis, who died Easter Monday, yesterday. And we will also be looking at the future of Catholicism and talking a bit about what the next papacy might look like. To have this conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Condon, who is founder and editor of The Pillar, which is a very essential reading website for Catholics and non-Catholics who are interested in the Catholic Church. Ed, thank you very much for coming on to Spectator TV. You wrote an excellent sort of quick-fire response to the death of the Pope, which was published on Spectator yesterday, in which you pointed out his virtues, and I think you are less critical than a lot of Catholics have been about Pope Francis. But you did said he leaves the church divided. Can you explain a bit the ways in which he's left his church divided and the ways in which perhaps it might be more divided now than it was at the start of his papacy?
Sure. I think it's unquestionably true, I think, in any fair-minded assessment to say that the church is more divided now than it was the day that Francis became Pope. Don't be wrong, the church had plenty of problems at the time of Francis's election, but one of the sort of great animating spirits of the Francis pontificate, I think, has been the reviving of debates and discussions that were thought over in the decades following the Second Vatican Council, a sort of revivifying of old grudges, old debates, old, in many cases, sort of theological civil war between wings of the Catholic Church that under the long pontificates of JP2 and then the slightly more abbreviated one of Benedict XVI were seen to sort of have been put to bed. And, the future of the church and the interpretation of the council, which was this great sort of defining moment in the church's history in the 20th century, appeared settled. And all of a sudden, everything seemed to be open again and up for grabs and up for debate. But while Francis was very good at re-raising all of these issues and sort of giving them oxygen and fanning them back into life, he didn't really give much of a firm steer on how he wanted those conversations to be resolved. You can relitigate all of those conversations if you want to definitively answer them, or you can relitigate them with a view to seeing what happens. And Francis seemed to be more and more a pope who wanted to see what happens. And I think, really looking at the final 5 years of his pontificate, it became clear Francis not only didn't have a clear vision for how he wanted it to end, I don't think he saw himself as the man to end it either. That he was very much creating a sort of new division, a new crisis time in the church that he expected his successor to answer. Now, you can have your own view on whether that was a reckless way for the Pope to govern the church, or perhaps a prescient one to say that, these debates never really went away. They were just buttoned up under hatches. And the next conclave, the one that we'll meet shortly, needs to have this conversation in full and needs to have it in a sort of no holds barred way. And there needs to be a final resolution to how the church sees itself in the 21st century.
And the issues that he sort of brought back into church debate are mostly matters relating to sexual morality or marriage. And as you say, he didn't actually change the church on these issues. Some might say he can't actually change the church on these issues. But he did seem to, in 2023, I think the church seemed to be moving towards accepting same-sex unions or giving blessings to same-sex unions, but then that was rowed back quite quickly. Similar issues on divorced and remarried Catholics, whether they can accept communion. There seemed to be some reform going on there, and then that didn't happen. And so he really was not a a substantial pope in that sense, for better or worse?
Well, it depends on what your metric is for success and substantial. With regards to marriage stuff, one of the first sort of big shaking up documents that he issued was something called Mitis Judex Dominus Jesus, which was a primarily legal text looking at how the church examines cases of marriage nullity. The church doesn't recognize divorce as a reality. It believes marriage to be permanent and indissoluble. But the church does recognize that some attempts to contract marriage were done in a flawed way, and that, a union can never have existed. I mean, anyone who knows the history of Henry VIII knows the difference between a church annulment and a civil divorce. And I think some of Francis's reforms on that were considered pretty radical at the time, but ultimately have shaken out rather well. I don't think much was changed there in terms of teaching or doctrine, but the practical mechanics of how those things got done, I think a lot of people, myself included, were very alarmed by what he was attempting. But generally speaking, we've seen that it's worked all right. On things like human sexuality, I think you're exactly right, that there's a lot of sort of sound and fury, and then what appears to be a lot of rowing back. The announcement made in December of 23 suggested and was certainly interpreted by a lot of people as saying the church had opened the door to the blessing of same-sex unions. And then very quickly, the department that issued that letter said, no, we're not talking about blessing the unions. We're talking about blessing the people. And there's an essential difference because, of course, gay people have equal human dignity to everyone else. And they should never be denied a blessing because the blessings are there for all people and all sorts of situations. So, again, nothing changed in sort of the teaching of the church. A lot of people felt that this was a fudge and that, it did nothing but disappoint both sides. Other people thought it was part of what Francis was very good at, which was not changing the teaching of the church, but changing the sort of music to which it was scored and saying, well, this is evidence that the church can be, fully recognizing of universal human dignity, for example, and creating a pastoral space for the care of gay Catholics. And they were happy with that. Unfortunately, he never went far enough for one side to be satisfied, and going any distance at all was too much for another. And so I think all of these things ended up causing more controversy than they ever resolved.
But he was a more popular figure, I think it's fair to say, with the secular world, certainly the left of centre, left liberal press, were much more enthused about him because he seemed to be more open to their worldview than his predecessors.
Yes, I think he had a knack for speaking in an intuitively emotional way, and certainly a comfort with being spontaneous that certainly Benedict XVI never had. He was very much an academic, a scholar. You couldn't imagine Benedict being comfortable giving an in-flight press conference, which sort of became one of Francis's hallmark ways of communicating with the world. And Francis was a firm adopter of things and causes that are very popular in the wider secular and liberal press. The cause of environmentalism, things like that. I think in a sense, he both created and benefited from a false impression of himself amongst the secular media, that he was seen to be less Catholic somehow than John Paul II or Benedict XVI when it came down to certain issues that, people outside of the church want to see or demand to see, like the ordination of women, things like that. He was right in step with his predecessors. He just appeared more fluent in front of them. But then again, they had a way of overlooking the things that Francis would say that they disagreed with. So you see a lot of coverage of Pope Francis, having a sort of "who am I to judge" approach, the great soundbite, even though it was a very narrowly given one. But you saw rather less coverage of the Pope calling the practice of abortion a eugenics practice and assassination with white gloves. That's not a quote that circulated very much in the New York Times or the Guardian or things like that. So I think there was a sort of self-selecting impression of Pope Francis, that people took him in the way they wanted to, and very few people made an effort to see him in the whole.
And he was very interested in what he calls the throwaway culture, which abortion comes into. It's a sort of vision of a very Christian understanding, I think, of the world as far too material, far too selfish, not sufficiently interested in the eternal questions.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Although there again, I think we have Francis at his best in that he wasn't necessarily saying or thinking or doing something out of step with or radically departing from his immediate predecessors. He was just a much more effective communicator of it. Benedict XVI has the sort of reputation and the image in the popular imagination of being a rather stern and obtuse academic who didn't really engage with things, and if anything was fiercely conservative, and people import all their own definitions of what conservative means. But I think if they ever read anything Benedict XVI wrote on economics, for example, or the politics of redistribution, they'd be appalled, and they'd think he was, some sort of, they'd think him somewhere to the left of Tony Blair. And I think this is true of a lot of popes, is that people make their judgments of who they are and what they believe more or less on how they perceive their character, rather than the actual content of what they say. And Francis was really, really good and very, very effective at inhabiting the character of Pope Francis that the media created for him.
You mentioned the Second Vatican Council earlier, and those two papacies, the very long one of John Paul II and the shorter one of Benedict XVI. And they, as you say in your piece, and as you said earlier, they were very much not exactly in reaction to the Second Vatican Council, but an attempt to stabilize the church after the Second Vatican Council and sort of put a brake on some of the more progressive forces that it perhaps unleashed. Do you think Pope Francis did the opposite?
I think so. How the church has lived the Second Vatican Council in the half century following it has been a point of great contention. The church, broadly speaking, I think falls into two camps: those who think the council is defined by the documents that it produced and the things that it actually said, and those who sort of think the Second Vatican Council was more of a sort of happening man. It was, moods and vibes and the spirit, and whatever was written down isn't really the point. Pope Francis was very keen to sort of re-enfranchise the moods and vibes camp. And you saw this in things like the synodal process that he wanted to have be his sort of great legacy. He was very keen to put people who had that sort of strain of thought or adhered to that sort of ecclesiology in charge of it, and to have a sort of dynamic approach to being church, as the phrase always has it. And I think at the same time, though, Francis actually showed himself to be quite an anti-Vatican II pope in some respects, in that one of the great reforms of the Second Vatican Council, great I mean in terms of scope rather than assigning moral value to it, is Vatican II versus Vatican I try to row back very hard on the sort of the sense of the imperial papacy, and that local diocesan bishops are sort of franchisees or branch managers of the Vatican, and rediscover the sort of the full dignity and spiritual import of the office of the diocesan bishop. Pope Francis was, whether people liked him or loathed him for it, an obsessive micromanager in many cases, and was very comfortable deposing bishops without any kind of due process or even reasons given in some occasions, which was something that, you simply wouldn't have thought possible under JP2 or Benedict, that, they were much more tolerant of alternative strains of thought and alternative voices of criticism than Francis showed himself to be. So he showed himself to be quite a sort of anti-Vatican II, or very Vatican I pope in that sense.
Mm. And with this elusive word synodality, and he, I believe, had a synod on synodality, what I think a lot of priests, from my understanding, felt slightly disempowered by it, because he was reaching out to the laity more. It was about a communication between the very top of the church and the very bottom. And a lot of people in the middle felt slightly disgruntled at the process. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a fair assessment of part of it. I think a lot of laity felt very disenfranchised by it, because in the same way that it felt for many people like the Vatican trying to talk to the people in the pews, many of the people who were actually in the pews on a Sunday felt they were missed out entirely by the process, because there was this great emphasis on, as Francis liked to say, going to the peripheries, the people who don't come to church, the people who have fallen out of the practice of the faith, the people who are very distant from the church in sort of mind and in heart and in body. And I think a lot of Catholics who, do practice the faith, take the faith very seriously, felt that, what they thought about the state of the church was pretty widely ignored by the synodal process in favor of people who really had nothing to say other than what the church needs to change in order for them to come back. Mm. And I think it's one of but this is the problem of the synodal process, was it was intended to involve everyone, but it was definitely a weighted exercise in that sense.
And to a lot of our Anglican viewers, synods might sound quite Anglican.
Yes, and for a lot of Catholics, they sounded very Anglican too.
Yeah, and for a lot of conservative Catholics, I think the fear was that the Catholic Church was going down the route of the Anglican Communion, which is now very divided and split geographically, particularly on matters relating to sex, between a liberal European Western faction and a global South, if you like, church that sees things in a very different way.
Yes, and I think this was a view that was shared by a lot of Catholics, conservative and liberal, during the synodal process. You had at the sort of top level, Pope Francis saying over and over again, the synod is not a parliament. It's not a sort of Anglican-style synodal body that, has governing force for the church. This is a consultative body that I'm convening under my authority, and I'll have the last word. But then you had experts on the synod put up by the Vatican to give press conferences and things who would cite the Anglican Church and its governing structures as saying, this is what we like the look of. And I think a lot of people in the Catholic Church have looked at the sort of Anglican example of, as you say, a rupturing of, the sort of global church in the global South from a sort of more liberal European model, and said, if we're not careful, the Catholic Church could end up in the same boat. But then you've had other people looking at it saying, well, actually, that looks quite appealing. The Catholic Church in Germany has been pretty upfront saying, we don't think we have very much in common theologically or ecclesiologically with the church in Africa, and we don't accept Roman authority to sort of keep us all bound together to one common creed and have one unified supreme teaching authority. We quite like to row that back. We want to see a federal model. So you have had sort of people who look at the Anglican example of synodality in an alarmed sense, but others look at it quite wistfully.
And I suppose looking to the future of Catholicism, this is probably its gravest challenge in terms of unity, because it is this hierarchical, non-democratic structure existing in a modern, often very liberal world. And since the Second Vatican Council, the tensions have always been between the church as an ancient structure and the church as a modern entity. And can it survive these pressures of the modern liberal world?
Yeah, it's an open question, I would say, to what extent the Catholic Church, in particular the structure of the Vatican, the Holy See, will continue in its present form, both sort of within the church and how it operates and exercises power, but also as a creature of international law, as a sort of international, observer at the United Nations and things like that. These are very much open questions at this point. And I think this is exactly the sort of, big picture conversation that the most charitable interpreters of the Francis pontificate would say he was very self-consciously setting up for this conclave, that he felt that this conversation needed to be had, it needed to be resolved definitively one way or another. And he saw it as his job to sort of tee up that debate. And, whether he intended to or not, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it does seem to be what he's done.
And on other crises for the Catholic Church, notably the lingering sexual abuse scandals within the Church and corruption within the Vatican, Francis inherited from Pope Benedict, who you correct me if I'm wrong, it's thought one of the reasons for his resignation was that he felt overwhelmed by the corruption, the scandals within the Church, and he felt he wasn't dealing with it very well. Do you think Pope Francis has made progress on that?
Well, we've certainly come a long way. Whether that constitutes progress or not, I think, is an open question. Yes, we tend to forget because Francis became such a sort of cultural icon in his own right that when he was elected, when he sort of came out onto the balcony at the Vatican, everyone understood that the reason that a non-Italian, non-European pope with no Roman experience had been elected was they needed a new broom to come in and sweep out the Vatican. That, you're exactly right. Benedict XVI is widely understood to have resigned in large part because he considered himself unequal to the urgent task of dealing with Vatican corruption. And Francis, to his credit, never shied away from big reforms, never shied away from making bold, dramatic decisions and passing legislation when necessary. But his Achilles heel seemed to be he was also a deeply personally loyal person. And so he always seemed to have this tendency, I want to say, to turn on his own reformers if he felt they went too far or they impinged on, the work of someone that he considered to be a close and trusted collaborator. And you saw this both in financial scandal matters that, Francis originally empowered and created all these new departments led by the Australian Cardinal Pell, and then sort of cooled on them and eventually turned on them when they started saying, no, we have to apply these, financial reform measures even to the people you like, not just the people you're suspicious of. And the same, I think, is true in the church's dealing with the lingering sexual abuse crisis, which was a big issue in the early years of his pontificate, certainly leading up 2018, was a sort of annus horribilis for him in that sense. and again, he called a global summit of all the world's bishops, passed landmark legislation. At the sort of theoretical legal level, it looked like great historical strides were being made. But then you saw that all break down when it came down to, well, there's actually a bishop in Argentina who's an old friend of Pope Francis who's accused of these things. Well, suddenly all the new rules went out the window, and certainly all the promises of transparency disappeared.
Mm. And I'm not going to ask you to speculate on who will be the next pope, because I think that's a very difficult guessing game. But it is, I think, probably fair to say that someone of a similar outlook to Francis, perhaps also outside of Europe, is quite likely to succeed, given the makeup of the College of Cardinals and the fact that he has appointed so many of these cardinals himself.
I don't know that I agree with that. I would say the chances of a Francis II, they're not zero, and they're not insignificant, but I'd put them at 1 in 5 at the most. It's true that Francis has appointed the vast majority of the cardinals who will elect his successor. But then again, it was a conclave composed entirely of John Paul II and Benedict appointed cardinals who produced Francis. So that's not necessarily a guide to anything. One thing that we can say is that Francis has appointed an incredibly diverse college of cardinals to elect his successor, and they don't know each other terribly well. And I don't think it's even necessarily fair to say that Francis knew them all terribly well himself, that he had a great desire to see the College of Cardinals reflect the geographic and demographic diversity of the church in different parts of the world, and it does do that. But I think, the idea that, for example, the half dozen some cardinals that Pope Francis named from Africa will all reflect a sort of Francis II world vision for the church, I think is pretty fanciful. I think we're in for a very interesting and very open conclave. I think you're right that, only a fool makes too strong of predictions, but I think we have a pretty clear understanding of this conclave will go one of two ways. It will be short and it will produce a sort of steady hand at the tiller. We've had more than a decade of a quite mercurial, up in the air papacy. We're ready for something a little more settled, a little more traditional, a little more solid. Or if it goes, beyond the first sort of 72 hours, first 3 days, you could see the cardinals start having these conversations, getting to know each other, and then we really could be in for another surprise pick along the lines of Karol Wojtyła, of whom almost no one had heard before he became John Paul II.
And whoever the next pope is, a big issue that they'll have to deal with is something you've written quite a lot about, which is the Vatican's relationship with Beijing. Yes. China obviously being the emerging superpower in the world at the moment. And under Pope Francis, this diplomatic agreement was brokered, which seemed to allow, does allow China to vet, essentially, church appointments. And that was quite a concession, and it angered a lot of Catholics, and it seemed to be against the sort of spirit of Catholicism to allow a foreign government to essentially do the Vatican's work for it. Do you think that will be something that the next pope will be under great pressure to reverse, or is it a done deal?
I think it's a done deal for the balance of the agreement, which I think it has another 2.5 years to run. It keeps being renewed periodically. And, it created a lot of ill feeling when it was agreed first in 2018. And it does, at least the theory of it is it allows the Chinese government to approve candidates from whom the Pope will then, quote unquote, in freedom, appoint bishops. But the reality has been, and this has been borne out time and time again, it's the Chinese government who appoints Catholic bishops on the mainland. That, they are picked by the Chinese government, they are announced by the Chinese government. In some cases, they are installed by the Chinese government, and the Vatican is left to, do what it likes with that reality after the fact. And most of the time, the Vatican has chosen to just sort of accept it as a fait accompli, although there have been some cases which are still unresolved because it's simply not ecclesiologically possible for the church to cede what the Chinese government have done. I think there needs to be a revisiting of that, but the problem is they are caught in a bit of a trap. The church didn't sort of wantonly deal away the sole discretion in the appointment of bishops for nothing. They wanted some sort of mechanism to bring the underground Catholic Church in China above ground, to give it some sort of secure legal footing so that the vast majority of Catholics in the country weren't at risk of arrest and imprisonment at any moment. Now, that hasn't actually materialized in quite the way I think the Vatican would have liked. The civil liberties of Catholics there have not been protected in the measure to which there was an expectation when all this was first agreed. But the problem is they're in the deal now. So and this is something I encounter talking to people who work in the Vatican Secretariat of State all the time, is they say, all right, fine, we pull out, but the deal we're in might not be making things measurably better, but pulling out could definitely make things measurably worse for the Catholics there. And that's the bind they're in now, is, they have opted to sup with the devil, and the spoon didn't turn out to be quite as long as they thought it was.
Well, an Asian pope may be quite important in that sphere, and there are thought to be strong contenders the next pope might be Asian.
Yes, there are one or two cardinals from Asia that certainly I think will be featuring in conversations in the general consistories the general congregations that precede the conclave, which I think is due to start a week Monday. There's Cardinal Tito Tagle, who everyone has a fairly high media profile. He's quite well known around Rome. He's one of the sort of, I guess you could say, 3 or 4 cardinals who enjoy a certain amount of name recognition, even if people don't necessarily have a firm grasp on who they are underneath it all. He's certainly a possibility, and he is, pretty warm on the China deal. He's pretty happy with it. That it's widely understood that he got his job as head of the Church's Department for the Evangelization in the Vatican, what used to be called Propaganda Fide back in the old days. That he got his job because his predecessor was moved out because he was insufficiently keen on the China deal. So Cardinal Tagle does come with that sort of baggage or endorsement of being open to warm relations with China, and sort of see that as steps that can be taken in a good direction. But that equally you have Cardinal Bo from Myanmar, who has been a fierce and vocal critic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, and denounced in previous years the Vatican's China deal as a sort of betrayal of Catholics there, and indeed of the Church in the Asian continent. So, you have polar opposites sort of there, both in the same conversation. So it'll be interesting to see who chooses to raise the issue as the cardinals are meeting and discussing, who wants to frame that conversation around the next pope.
Well, I promised I wasn't going to try and get into runners and riders, but given that we've just been talking about Asia, and of course China against America as the two competing superpowers in the world is one of the big political stories of our time, the geostrategic stories of our time. I've heard some people talking today about the possibility of an American pope. Do you think that is a likely outcome?
No. I would predict a pope from almost any other continent before I would predict one from the United States. I think there's one Canadian in the mix, Cardinal Collins. He'd be a great pope. I'd be happy with that, but I think it's unlikely. I would be shocked for a North American to step out onto the loggia when it's all over. I think there have in the past, and even the recent past, been Americans who might have been an interesting candidate for the job, but they have by and large aged out. I think Cardinal Sean O'Malley, formerly of Boston, was probably the last one who had a sufficiently global profile amongst his brother cardinals that may have been considered as a candidate. But as I say, he's over 80 now, so he won't even be in the conclave.
Well, Ed, we'll leave it there. But thank you very much for coming on to Spectator TV, and I hope we'll get you on again as the conclave progresses.
Next, looking ahead at the local elections next week, how afraid should Labour be of reform? James Heal spoke to Arron Banks, the former UKIP donor who is standing for reform in the West Country mayoral election.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm James Heal. I'm delighted to be joined today by Arron Banks. Now, Arron is perhaps best known for being a party donor to first UKIP, then the Brexit Party, and now Reform. But he's also now standing as a candidate for the West of England mayoralty next week. This position was created in 2017. It was won first by the Conservatives and then by Labour's Dan Norris. And now it's up for election this time in the West of England. Now, Arron, first of all, you've been involved in politics now for more than a decade. But what's it like being a sort of first-time candidate, and how's it going on the campaign trail?
Well, I was actually a candidate for the Conservatives back when I was 21, but it's nothing like this. Good morning, James, by the way. I didn't say good morning. So, yeah, it's been fun. I was out in a pub in Bristol called the Three Lions yesterday, which is mainly Bristol City supporters. And the support for reform is huge. You can feel it shifting away from Labour in Bristol. So it's going to be an interesting night, I think.
And have you been out canvassing much yourself? And what are people saying to you in terms of the issues on the doorstep?
Yeah, look, I've been out quite a bit, but the apathy relating to the West of England mayor, I think, is overwhelming. I maybe have livened the contest up a little bit, but it's not a massive job really. It's coordination of transport and a few other bits and bobs. It's actually quite a weak job if I'm honest.
But I think that, your entry in the race has already sparked some headlines. I mean, we did a story saying that you've been in a fight with Bristol City Council because they wouldn't let you use a slogan based on your own surname.
Well, there's a bit of handbags at dawn. It was use my own name, but they were worried that it might infringe the Banksy copyright. So they're obviously more worried about an illegal street artist than a candidate for mayor.
Well, I mean, as someone who went to University of Bristol and sort of know the politics of that place, I imagine that, you can see that perhaps coming into some of the fold, really. I just wanted to tell us about the sort of...
Well, I did say if Banksy wanted to paint a £100,000 picture on the back of my house, he's very welcome to come and do it,
We'll see if Banksy takes up the offer.
I doubt so.
And tell us about the sort of politics of the West of England. So obviously 2017, a Conservative won the mayoralty. Then 2021, it was Dan Norris for Labour. And now now obviously the race itself is going to be conducted under the old first past the post system for mayoralties. So that means it's just one round. And of course, that means there's potential.
Well, it is a very interesting area from a political point of view because you've got the Greens, you've got Labour, you've got the Liberals, you've got the Conservatives, you've got us. It really is a five-way race that could be won on, I saw a poll with us neck and neck with the Greens on 23%. So, it'll be an exciting election in the sense that there's three parties that could potentially win on the night.
And do you think that Reform is just basically eating into that Conservative vote? Because, I mean, the Conservatives have done traditionally pretty well in the West of England. Obviously,
do you know what? It's such a diverse area. I know people are fond of saying that, but you've got the Shire kind of places in South Gloucestershire. You've got them in Somerset, but you've got Bristol and Bath. I mean, the area of Bedminster I was in yesterday was a very run-down area. It would be a traditional Labour heartland, but you can see it's just switching over to Reform like crazy. So I think this kind of perception that Reform is damaging the Tories, I mean, the whole shift almost since the last election has been with collapsing Labour vote going into Reform. So, I mean, in this seat or this area, the Tories can't win. I mean, they might even come fifth place. Particularly with the Greens so strong in Bristol, Labour, Liberal Democrats. It really is a genuine five-way split.
And how do you think, someone who's been involved in UKIP or sort of Euroscepticism and the Brexit Party, and what's the sort of change this time? I mean, I spoke to Nigel Farage a few months ago, and he said that that was Europe, that was one cause. This is so much bigger than that. Why is Reform doing so much better in some of the areas where, for instance, UKIP didn't have as much cut through?
I just think people have had enough, and I think they've seen the damage that the Conservative Party did to the country, and that's now been followed up by Labour. And it goes much wider than Brexit, 100%. I mean, I was talking to two lads in the Three Lion pub who were trainee bricklayers, and they have to stay at home with their parents. They're broke by the end of the week, with the money that they got just isn't enough. And I think this is it's a feature maybe it is a feature of anyone but the above, but I think Nigel's tapped into people that maybe don't normally vote as well. So that, expanding that franchise is very, very dangerous for the established parties, because what you've seen is their share of the vote gradually coming down from, where it was up at 75, 80%, it's below 50% now and dropping. And I think, Keir Starmer says Nigel had, what was it? He said the Conservative Party for breakfast. Well, it's, the Labour Party for lunch and tea at the moment. So, the only people talking about an alliance or coalition of the Tories, because, I think they're finished as a political force. They're starting to fade away.
I mean, I do think that it's quite striking how much the conversation now revolves around, Labour reform or Nigel Farage, etc., rather than Kemi Badenoch. And I do think that's, if you look at focus,
I think our only dangerous or only problem is how the hell are we going to keep her in place for 4.5 years? It's going to be really difficult to keep her in place. But I think what you're seeing is the death of the Conservative Party. I mean, I spoke to a number of people yesterday who were Conservative Party members that had come out to the pub to support me, and they're still Conservative Party members. They said, well, we've got friends, we've got associations, but actually they're supporting Nigel all the way down the line,
So tell me about the sort of reform members, because, I mean, anecdotally, and I can see this a bit when I go to conferences and stuff, there seems to be sort of younger. I think reform says that half its members have never been members of a political party before. So there are some Tories joining. But how would you sort of...
That's what I'm talking about, tapping into people that have never voted before. It's quite astonishing. But also as well, I think, the young vote is going partially to the Greens and partially to reform, which is kind of a little bit of not the established parties. We hate them. So they're making their choice. They either go down the reform route, which a lot of youngsters are. Certainly those bricklayers in the pub last night were rabidly pro-Nigel. Or you go down the green route. So you're seeing this fragmentation of British politics in a way that is brand new. Maybe it's happened in America. Maybe that's why Trump got elected. And I think we see the same kind of, phenomenon playing out.
And I mean, you've obviously known Nigel Farage for a long time. How do you think he's approaching this campaign in 2029? How do you think he's changed in sort of his leadership or sort of style of doing politics?
I think he's slightly more moderate than he was. I think he's, coming over as a little bit more middle of the road. But I mean, the guy's work ethic is second to none. I mean, I see Kemi out occasionally with a Barber jacket doing this, that, or the other. Nigel's literally everywhere. I spoke to him last night and I said, how the hell are you doing this? He was in 5 counties in one day and still got back to Parliament. I mean, he's working his socks off. But I think that's starting to reflect the fact that you can see the groundwork of support. And even in the polls like YouGov yesterday, the YouGov poll isn't necessarily favourable to reform, and the polls tend to underestimate the support. So I think we're expecting to have a very good day on the 1st of May, and I think chances are we'll probably win that by-election.
Yeah, Runcorn. I mean, I think that Nigel Farage by polling day will have visited every county up for election and visited Runcorn 3 times as well. So really putting the effort in there. I think I was quite struck by one of the things Reform is very good at in this campaign, and seems to be paying off, is the mix of old and new. So Nigel obviously does a lot of barnstorming. He likes to go and do speeches, old style stumping. But there's also some new elements. So, obviously there's the social media side, but also Reform is using these free information requests. So more than 3,000 across councils across the country. And that also almost in a sort of election where, I think all the parties are desperate to talk about other things. So the Lib Dems want to talk about Trump. And that offers something for Reform to talk about. So I just wondered,
I think that's actually very interesting. I mean, when the first thing I did as, a candidate was say, well, let's, do some FOIs, actually have a look and see what these guys have been doing. And the misuse of public money is on an epic scale. I mean, the current mayor has been investigated by the police, and we don't know the outcome of that yet. It's obviously allegations, but I noticed at the bottom of the list, of quite a few things was misallocation or misuse of public money. And you see things like, for instance, they spent 40 million quid on changing the buses to green buses, and then essentially ran out of money and had to cancel half of the subsidised bus services. So I think a big area, you say, well, where is Nigel changing? I think people are looking for core competence from politicians, actually not to be right or left or ideological, but to actually just do the job properly. And I think that's where, local politics has been a ground really for politics in a way that it never was 30 or 40 years ago. You had a town clerk, you had a sensible group of elected people, whether they were Labour or Conservative, that ran the place fairly efficiently. That's all changed.
Yes,
So I think he's tapped into something really valuable there, misuse of public money, and how that can be straightened out. I mean, one of the stats I saw, which blew my mind, was that Cornwall County Council had run up £1 billion in debt. I mean, I find that astonishing that they're even allowed to, and that something like Cornwall could borrow £1 billion.
Of course, there are problems that come with success, and potentially next week you could see a couple of hundred new reform councillors. And obviously that is fantastic in one sense, in showing that a vote for reform does get you reform, and can obviously give reform the chance to sort of prove their mettle in office. But how do you think, given the sort of sometimes traditionally growing parties, developing parties have sometimes fallen out with each other, how do you think managing the egos will go in reform?
I think that politically that's a problem, isn't it? Right, and it will be a problem for reform as well. I think one of the things we were talking about nationally was whether you had a sort of team of very good people that went out to councils. Let's say if we win 2 or 3 councils, and kind of sit them down and say, well, actually, it's not business as normal. You need to reform the way this council is doing it, and actually help them to do it. Because a lot of the candidates are just normal, everyday, decent people. I mean, I met people like that in the pub yesterday crying out for change. So I'm sure at a national level, we'll be trying to help them with the infrastructure and the kind of thought processes they need to turn things around. But if you look at, let's say, the national level, if Reform won a general election, it's all about leadership. It's the same in business. If you've got the right leaders, good things happen. And to be perfectly honest with you, you look at the police, it's not police, officers on the ground that are doing bad things. It's the leadership from above that just isn't there.
Yeah, I think elite cues certainly do matter in lots of these organisations. So if you're elected the Mayor of the West of England next Friday, what will be your sort of first act in office then?
Well, actually, on that theme, that's what I wrote in my sort of pamphlet out to the public, is that there's 3 councils it covers. And I think the first job is to make sure those councils are actually doing what they should be doing properly, audit them, actually look into the services they provide and make sure the money's going to where it should be going. That's kind of outside the remit of this mayor role, but I think that's, although you don't have the power to do it, I think that's something where, as you mentioned with Nigel and the FOIs, actually forcing councils to come to terms with the money they're spending and publicising where they're recklessly wasting taxpayers' money. And then I think the second thing is, what sort of big infrastructure projects could we deliver for Bristol that are backed by private money rather than the need to keep running back to government for funds? I mean, Bristol's suspension bridge was wholly built with private money and private innovation, etc. Although someone pointed out when they used that example, it took me 40 years to build the thing. Because Brunel died and it all got into a bit of a mess. So maybe even back then it was a problem.
Well, I take that over the mess involving Hammersmith Bridge, currently right now, still closed after 7 years.
Quite, yeah. I mean, there's the standout example, isn't it, of idiocy on the highest possible level.
Extraordinary stuff.
I mean, I haven't actually followed that. Is there any nearer to any sort of conclusion?
I think it's still 2028, 2029. So it's crazy. I mean, India's been able to put a rocket in space for less money, I believe, which is sort of depressing. But talking of money, also, I mean, you first hit the headlines for being a donor to UKIP. I wondered, you must talk to a lot of these sort of businessmen, etc., on the right, some of them who are sort of waiting to see how it sort of shakes out Reform versus Tory. But what are they sort of saying when you're at these sort of fundraisers, etc.?
Well, I think this is the other massive thing that, people are starting. I mean, we had dinner with Marco Pierre-White the other day, although he's not a donor. And you're starting to see people are actually saying, look, we need to change the dynamic of this country. So you've got people that wouldn't normally get political starting to raise their head above the parapet. And I think Reform will go into the next general election better funded than the Conservative Party, if I can put it that way.
And why? I mean, I've read the reports about the fundraiser. That was the big one where sort of the singing "God Save the King" and sort of the Union Jacks, etc. I mean, my sort of thought is perhaps, just make politics fun. I mean, obviously, clearly there's important work to be done, but one of the reasons I think the donors, obviously, as well as wanting to change things for the better, also want to have a bit of fun. And it seems that the Reform fundraiser...
Well, you know what, that's very true. I mean, I always tell a story on Brexit Day when we won, and we got invited to the Ritz by Freddie Bartley for kippers, because obviously, Nigel, you kippers were famously called kippers. So we had plates of kippers, and he had actually decorated the Ritz out in Union Jacks on every every room. The front went mental. And as we were having, breakfast with Freddie, his phone went off, and the tone was "God save the Queen." So actually, this kind of sense of fun is something I think Nigel's brilliant at, and I think we're going to bring a lot more pizzazz to it. He already has. I mean, the way he campaigns is brilliant. But, in politics, you're always going to have car smashes like the Rupert Lowe thing. There will always be controversy and big egos, tend towards that,
I think that's going to be... I mean, I spoke to one person in the Reform who said that, the only person who can stop us is ourselves. And so I suppose it's like the great things which make Reform successful, the sort of iconoclasm, the sense of fun, the passion, the drive. I see how hard some of the guys in Reform HQ work. That can sometimes counterbalance, but that will be the great story about the next 5 years or so.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because what's thrown at Reform is you don't have policies, or you don't have experience in government. Well, I think we could do a little less experience from Labour and Conservative over what they've done. I mean, if that's the experience grown-ups running the country, run up £5 trillion of debt, 2.8 of national debt, 2.2 of unfunded pension Ponzi schemes, perhaps we need a little bit less professional treasury management if that's the outcome of it all.
Well, we look forward to seeing the alternative to that so-called professional treasury outcome over the next few years. Arron, thank you very much for joining us on Spectator TV.
Finally, how much trouble is Pete Hegseth in? There are reports Trump might get rid of his defense secretary. Freddie Gray spoke to Spectator US editor-at-large Ben Dominic about the story.
Hello and welcome to the Americano Show. Today we are going to be talking about Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, who appears to be under threat. His job appears to be under threat after a very difficult week for him, in which quite a few of his top staff have been removed. And there are lots of whispers about the fact he may be about to be fired. This does go back to, although may not be directly connected to, Signalgate, in which Pete Hegseth's texts about bombing the Houthis were shared with The Atlantic's editor-at-large, Jeffrey Goldberg. But there have been lots of other murmurings of discontent coming out of the Pentagon, and there seems to be some sort of ideological clash going on between Pete Hegseth, possibly Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor. It's all very nefarious and hard to get to the bottom of it, but who better to get to the bottom of it with than the Spectator's editor-at-large, who has written about this, Ben Dominic. Ben, welcome back to Americano. We did talk, I think the last time we spoke was about Signalgate. And this story, well, first of all, how much do you think this story, this pressure that Hegseth seems to be under, how much does it go back to Signalgate?
Well, I think that the narrative that is in the wider press that this is connected to Signalgate is very commonly held. But just because something is common wisdom does not mean that it's correct.
Usually,
and I think in this
usually
sense,
the opposite.
It's actually quite the opposite. Signalgate was an embarrassment, but it actually was not as embarrassing, I think, as some people understand in terms of, who actually was hurt the most by it. The person who was hurt the most by it was Mike Waltz and his staff. Waltz had to do covering for his staff who actually, pulled the trigger and pulled things together. It was Hegseth's spin that was afterwards about the information that he was sharing that made him look bad. I do just want to hold up. I know that we're not supposed to endorse, rivals within our business, but I did find it interesting that when the New Yorker put out their cover, evoking the closing scenes, of course, of Dr. Strangelove, they have all these different cabinet people on it. notably absent is Mike Waltz, and notably front of center is Pete Hegseth.
Ben, please put it a bit more in the center of the screen so the viewers can see.
And I found that to be kind of interesting at the time, in part because I understand that Hegseth is more recognizable, than someone like Waltz, who's a little bit more nondescript looking. But it did seem to kind of be putting him front and center as the person that Washington found to be the most distrustful in this element. And let's go back and understand who these different people are. Mike Waltz has been around for quite some time. He worked, obviously, during the Bush administration. He was someone who, had multiple roles at that time within the security infrastructure. He's 50. He's a little more established, and a guy who's an ex-Green Beret, and someone who, at least in terms of Washington, is respected among the Republican national security set. That's not the same background that Pete Hegseth comes from. He comes from, obviously the class of the tattooed he codes as being a little bit more out of sync with the way that Washington expects their military leadership, their defense secretaries in particular, to look. Certainly, he doesn't fit the mold that people normally expect. And I think that there's a good bit of motivation, at least during his hearing, and the targets on his personal life, his background, and, his multiple wives and different, relationships that came under fire, that I think was indicative of that this is someone who doesn't really fit the Washington establishment's view of what a defense secretary should look like. His response to the Signalgate situation was not a good one. He made some pretty broad claims about no war plans being discussed of any nature, as opposed to the more narrow claims that someone like Tulsi Gabbard was making about, no actual violations of classified material, et cetera. And rather than stick to that narrow portion, Hegseth went wider. That prompted Jeff Goldberg to leak nearly the entire text chains, where you saw that there was actually something else interesting going on, which was an ideological discussion, a policy disagreement, really, between the vice president, between Pete Hegseth, between Mike Waltz, and between others within the administration about what to do in this circumstance. Now, we've discussed before, the president made a decision when he came back into office that he was going to have a spectrum of belief. He was not going to just go in one direction when it came to the ideology that he pursued on foreign policy, not just an America first, not just an isolationist, not just a neocon, not just a hawk, et cetera. He was going to have a spectrum of belief. And that includes, of course, someone like Marco Rubio and someone like Tulsi Gabbard. It's not just going to be one lane. And what I think we've seen is that within that spectrum, there are different points of contention and different viewpoints on the priorities within the world. And Pete, I believe, Pete Hegseth has occupied now a position that is slightly different than perhaps people expected. He was, of course, someone who joined up and fought within the war on terror of his own willingness back, in the day, and was someone who was traditionally viewed as being in the mainstream of the Republican hawkish lane. Yet he'd moved, of course, closer to President Trump over the years. Now, I think, after seeing that discussion and after some of the other public comments that he's made, and we can get into that, I think that he is now being viewed as someone who is an obstacle to some of the people who would like to see an approach in Ukraine, in Iran, and others that is more aligned with J.D. Vance and the things that he's been saying, less aligned perhaps with Marco Rubio, with Mike Waltz, and with others within the administration. And by virtue of being in this position at a moment when he's viewed as having a recent botch, I think that there are a lot of knives out for Pete Hegseth at this moment, chipping away at him. And that's something that has more motivations than just stumbling over yourself in spinning what was clearly a mistake.
Well, something we spoke about last time was the Israel-Iran factor in Signalgate. And we discussed the idea that perhaps Vance and Hegseth, and perhaps others too, were pretextualizing their conversation by making it about Europe. Vance was saying, I don't want to be bailing out Europe again because, all this shipping actually benefits Europe, not America. And while there may have been some purpose to that discussion, what they were actually talking about was whether we should be doing Israel's bidding on striking targets, Iran-linked targets. And since we had that discussion, there's been this interesting story about how close the administration may or may not have come to actually joining an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. And it seems it came pretty close. And if the reporting is correct, Hegseth sided against that. And the speculation is that a lot of the removals from Hegseth's office, particularly Dan Caldwell, who has gone on Tucker Carlson's show to say as much, they were removed because they were relatively dovish on Iran compared to the Hawks. And the speculation is the Hawks come from Mike Baltz's faction. And so it seems not just that knives are out in Hegseth's office, but also in Baltz's office. You're seeing some Israel Hawks coming under pressure and leaving. Is that the knife fight that's really going on? It's about very pro-Israel Hawks versus people who are more dovish about Iran.
I think this is in very large part about the argument regarding Iran and what should be done there. And the fact that Hegseth is in this kind of no man's land in the middle, where he's viewed as being too hawkish for some of the people who are on the, total pullback, we shouldn't be doing anything Israel wants us to do side. And also, at odds with some of the people who want basically to go in there guns blazing, means that he has critics from both sides. And that's why I think you saw the kind of total senior staff removal that happened over the course of the weekend. Really, you had three major staffers who were all senior, including Caldwell, who, by the way, used to work for Defense Priorities, which is one of the more I would not describe it as isolationist, but very restrained, very dovish entities in Washington, which have propped up basically since the war on terror. And he obviously already went and said his piece on Tucker Carlson. You also had, the former, he was essentially in line to be temporarily the spokesperson for the department, John Ulyat, go to the pages of Politico to unleash an absolute, blistering attack on what was going on in the Pentagon, describing it as chaotic and basically saying, I like Pete, but he's not the man for the job. Essentially, in not so many words. And I think that a good part of this is that there are just different factions who are warring with each other about what the president really wants. The irony of all of this is that I think that the truth of the matter deep down is that the president is actually more hawkish on some of these things than some of the people seem to be willing to admit to themselves, meaning that, if you look back at the presidents who have questioned the idea that the Iranian regime was one that we truly needed to fear for their, ability to upend the region, et cetera. The two most recent Republican presidents who really questioned that the most, of course, were Ronald Reagan, who just woke up one day and decided to eliminate the entire Iranian Navy over the course of a day in Operation Praying Mantis, and then, of course, Donald Trump, who decided that he was going to kill their top military leader, and not just in some private area, but going to the airport in the VIP area. And so the point is, Donald Trump has not shied away from, pulling the trigger when he thinks that he can do something against the Iranian regime. And what we've seen in recent years, I would argue, is that the Iranians have turned out to be rather a paper tiger when it comes to their response to some of these things. Now, at the same time, I think there are legitimate concerns that in this case, were the United States to allow Israel to do what they want to do in ending the Iranian nuclear program by force and with swift strikes, or at least try to, I think they'd probably, given the level of success that they've had in recent months with their other attempts in the region, I think that you could have a lot of faith that they'd be pretty successful at that. There are domino effects. There are growths of that could be very negative for the region. I think that's why you have people like Tulsi Gabbard and others raising concerns. But one thing that I do think is going on for Hegseth is, again, he is the least used to Washington of all of these people. Rubio has been there. Tulsi has been there. Mike Waltz has been there. They've all been around. They've all been on Capitol Hill. They all have these relationships. They all have these pre-existing stances. And even if people disagree with them ideologically, they're not viewed in the same outsider terms that Pete Hegseth is. And I say this as someone, I should probably led with this at the beginning, as someone who considers Pete, a friend. We've always been friendly and cordial. And work together at Fox News on multiple things. I think highly of him, and I know a lot of people in the military community who think highly of him. But this is also a very demanding job, one of the largest bureaucracies in the world. And to go in there with a bunch of people who are your military friends, who from the before time, but have very little experience in that building, if at all, that's a real challenge. And I think in this case, we've seen that's why he has not really been able to defend or protect some of his underlings the way that you might have seen from someone who is more experienced in Washington.
It's clear that he seems to have riled up the defense establishment, but something he's obviously good at is winning over Donald Trump. Early reports about how he got nominated were that he just sort of presented himself in Mar-a-Lago at the right moment, and it crossed Donald Trump's mind to appoint him, and that's how it happened. I don't know whether that's true or not, but those certainly were the reports.
That is what I've heard as well, yes.
And the rumors. And then last weekend, on Easter weekend, he did this extraordinary statement to the cameras with his sons behind, coming out firing. And this, again, during his nomination process, when he was under pressure, Donald Trump urged him to go on the front foot, to be aggressive. And in a way, it seems that rather than actually being under pressure, this might boost him in the mind of Donald Trump that, yes, he's coming under a lot of attack, but he's hitting back hard.
Yeah. I think that the things that have boosted him are, one, the initial Signalgate operation was obviously a success that has, from their perspective or the perspective of the president, continued. But the other thing is, but I have to admit, I did not think that the White House Easter egg roll was going to be as newsy as it turned out to be. Otherwise, I would have taken the time to go there. I thought I had to file an article, and so instead I did that. But I do think that his stance toward this is one that appeals to Trump, and at least temporarily is one that is going to actually put him on pretty solid footing. The idea that there is that the bottom's dropping out from under him, the walls are closing in, et cetera, I just don't think that's true yet. Because one of the things that can happen is when you take that strong step forward, you have to back it up with the way things work out. And look, I don't think that the president has any misgivings about riling the defense establishment, especially after his experience in his first term, where he was so, frankly, angry, furious with some of the people he appointed, including people at the recommendation of top individuals, to the defense and foreign policy space who turned out to be big disappointments to him, or even betrayed him openly, turned against him in his 2024 campaign, including. And I think he views Hegseth as being intensely loyal, a strong fighter, and someone who can go on TV and make this case for himself. At the same time, I think that Hegseth would be better served if he had some people around him who could make that case for him. It's only because John Kirby was so good at his job that people didn't really pay attention when Lloyd Austin just sort of disappeared for a couple of days and no one really knew where he was, which is a pretty, ridiculous thing to think about in retrospect. But look, Hegseth is certainly someone who I think is occupying this middle position where not everybody knows who they can trust in terms of what they're going to do, how they're going to respond to these moments. And he certainly comes out of this having been weakened by the fact that he had to lose so many of these people who had been close to him for a long time. Who he replaces them with could be critical in terms of how much of this reform agenda toward defense is successful in the months and years to come.
And lastly, Ben, could we just look at what's going on in the National Security Council? Because
Sure.
It's interesting that it's not just a case of the Hawks killing the doves in the Pentagon, or realists, if you want, in the Pentagon. But there also seems to be quite a lot of things happening at the National Security Council. And on that side, it seems like the pro-Israel elements are being purged. What's going on there?
Well, I think sadly, for those of us, and myself included, who think that the priorities of Israel as an ally are ones that are aligned with the American and the Western interest generally. I think that there is an effort to purge some of those, and I think that a lot of that has to do with the reaction to some of what we've seen come out of Steve Witkoff's work in these early negotiations in Oman with the Iranians, where, frankly, what he's talking about has sounded a lot more like what the Obama administration and the JCPOA were attempting to do than the pro-Israel types are comfortable with. And that's something that I think was always going to be a point of contention, given that Witkoff was given such a broad sinecure in terms of his ability to just go around the world and have to, do all these different negotiations. I think at some point the president's going to have to make a decision about that, about which horse he's going to bet on in terms of things moving forward. And it certainly can't be something that makes the folks around Netanyahu feel all that comfortable, given the fact that they had expected, as with so many other expectations for this administration, it may not have turned out the way that the people going in wanted, that this would be an administration that essentially took the polar opposite stance from what the Biden administration had been doing over the last 4 years. Witkoff's role within this, I think, is critical, and the fact that behind the scenes he seems to be having such significant influence and downstream effects is something that I think concerns a lot of people, not just in the traditional hawkish sector of the Republican Party, but also those who view the Israeli conflict in particular as being a special case.
Ben, it's always fascinating to hear your insights. Thank you very much for coming on to Americano, and happy Easter.
That's all from us this week. If you're not subscribed, you can do so below to never miss a new episode. Thank you for joining, and catch you next week.